I wonder if she could use it.
Good afternoon and welcome to Grant Cottage. Thank you all for coming up. Steve Trimm to my right does many of these Porch Chats, as some of you will know. Today's is on the relationship or the parallels between Grant and Dwight Eisenhower. We have some other events coming up this summer, including on Sunday, August 5th, we'll have a picnic performance with music. On Wednesday, August the 8th, we'll have a Flags Half-Mast ceremony. That's the date of Grant's New York City funeral in 1885. But when this program ends, we will do tours. For those of you who bought tickets down in the visitor center, it may be that we won't be able to get you all in on the first tour, but I may take a group down to the Overlook, and there's other things around here that you can look at while you wait for the tours to begin. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Steve, who also, in case he doesn't tell you, has a recently published book on saving Grant Cottage, which is on sale down in the visitor center.
It's actually a booklet. It's not as grandiose as a book, but it does have some pretty good stories. All right, one of the great joys about being a history buff is when you find information about someone in the past that's brand new to you. And even better is when you discover that beliefs you held about someone are totally wrong. That's really exciting. And here at Grant Cottage, we just have a small community of amateur historians, and we are always talking and we are learning from each other. And if you ever want to volunteer and join us, we'll be glad to see you here. Where did this crazy idea for this Porch Chat come from? Well, volunteers know it is related that before Dwight Eisenhower wrote his memoirs about fighting in Europe, he read Grant's memoirs. And that's all we're usually ever told. I found that intriguing, and I wanted to know, first of all, so he read them. So what? Did he follow Grant's lead in any way? So that's where I'm going to begin. Grant's memoirs have never been out of print. I think Eisenhower probably read them at West Point initially, but he reread them after World War II. So, I got a copy of Eisenhower's memoir, Crusade in Europe, and I read it. And I discovered that he, in fact, had followed Grant's lead. Eisenhower, like Grant, checked his ego at the door. He wrote almost objectively of what he had seen and what he had experienced, and he did not put himself in the center of the story as the great hero of civilization. Grant did not put himself in the center of his story as the great hero of the Union. Both men were very modest about their roles in their particular wars. So yes, Eisenhower did follow Grant's lead. And I thought that's where my inquiry was going to end. But by chance, I don't always read about Civil War history. I read stuff from all historical eras, including the 1960s in America. I lived through that time, as you did, and I'm still trying to figure out what went on. So, by chance, I was reading this book, Remembering America, by Richard Goodwin. You have heard of Doris Kearns Goodwin? This is her husband. He worked in the Kennedy White House and then the Johnson White House. And that's where he met Doris, actually, was in LBJ's White House. And Richard Goodwin was the liberals' liberal, the penultimate liberal. And I thought I knew what I was going to read here, but I was surprised. Goodwin begins his book with the incoming Kennedy administration and the outgoing Eisenhower administration. And to my astonishment, here's what Goodwin wrote about Ike. He brought the Korean conflict to a swift conclusion, and throughout his term, he sent no Americans into combat. He was the first president since Hoover of whom this could be said, and he was to be the last for a long time. This was not merely good fortune. In Hungary and Cuba, Indochina, and the Straits of Formosa, Eisenhower resisted pressure for forceful intervention to which other presidents might have yielded. Clearly, the masses of India and Brazil and Italy and the United States understood something about this man that those of us closer to him, those of us who thought we were more sophisticated, failed to grasp. Eisenhower was a man of peace. He was infused with an essential goodwill toward his companions of the earth. They knew it, and they loved him for it. There were worse things than inaction, much worse. Well, I was shocked that a good liberal would say this about Eisenhower, whom I always thought of as a pretty traditional conservative. But there was a line here that just stopped me in my tracks. Well, two lines actually. He said, Eisenhower was a man of peace. He was infused with an essential goodwill toward his companions of the earth. That could describe Ulysses S. Grant. It really could. On Grant's tomb in New York City is carved, "Let us have peace." And at no time during the Grant administration did we go to war with anybody. Grant, despite having commanded the greatest army this continent has ever seen, was fundamentally and truly a man of peace. So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, wow, when I came here to Grant Cottage the first time, I had all the stereotypes. Grant's a drunkard and a butcher, and I discovered that was wrong. So maybe I'd been wrong all these years about Eisenhower. It was really worth looking into, I thought. So, time for another book. I found a biography. Ike, the American Hero. Got a poster of it here. Picked this up by chance. It's by a fellow named Michael Korda. We do not have a copy of this book for sale, so I'm not hawking the book, but this was the biography I found. So I'm reading through it, learning a lot, and somewhere 60 pages into the book, Mr. Korda suddenly compares Ike to Grant. And I thought that was interesting, but I let it go. Another 50 pages in, there's another explicit comparison between Eisenhower and Grant. And now I'm scratching my head. I said, who is this Korda guy that he's even thinking of Grant? So now I finally did my homework on Mr. Korda. It turns out that he wrote his biography of Eisenhower in 2007. This was after he wrote a best-selling book on the Battle of Britain called With the Wings of Eagles. Mm-hmm. He wrote this book on Ike in 2007, but in 2004, he'd written a biography of Grant. It's a little tinier than the biography of Ike, but here it is. Mr. Korda wrote about both these men. He compared them, and I was flabbergasted at some of the comparisons he came up with. So I want to share some of those with you. I will mention, just in passing, because all biographies mention it, that both these families, the Grants and the Eisenhowers, are quintessentially American. The first Grant ancestor to come to America was a Puritan. He came to Massachusetts Bay in 1630. The first Eisenhower ancestor came in 1741. They were Pennsylvania Dutch, which is to say German. And strangely enough, the Eisenhowers were Mennonites. You might not know the Mennonites, but they are pacifists. They in no way will engage in violence. Historically, they have sent none of their boys to war. The Eisenhowers were Mennonites. Well, Ike's dad had drifted away from the pacifist side of the Mennonite religion, but I have to say that the stubbornness associated with the Mennonites carried on, as Ike would be the first to admit. All right, let me begin with some of the parallels Mr. Korda found between these two men. And we're going to start with the silly stuff. All right? The silly stuff. In high school, in 1908, Ike appeared in a Shakespearean play, The Merchant of Venice. He appeared as Lancelot Gobbo, a servant to Shylock. This character is a clown. Ike got great reviews and never stepped on stage again in his life. Here's the parallel. Ulysses S. Grant, as the American Army was gathering on the border with Mexico, just before the start of the Mexican War, a bunch of officers put on a play, a Shakespearean play. Turned out this one was Othello, and Ulysses S. Grant had the lead female role. He appeared as Desdemona. You got to remember, this is at a time the man had no beard. He was clean-shaven, handsome young fellow, so he could do the female part. He had a competitor in the auditions for the role of Desdemona, James Longstreet. Longstreet did not get the role because he was too tall. Okay. What did Ike think he was going to be when he grew up? What was his hope?
Sailor.
Well, yes and no. Originally, here's what he said. I wanted to be a real Major League Baseball player, a genuine player like Honus Wagner. Grant, who turned out to be really good in mathematics, thought at one point he might be a math professor. But as he looked back in his later years, he thought, you know, I was happiest when I was a farmer. That is really what I was cut out for. So their careers didn't go the way these guys thought they would. So there's the silly stuff. Now the moderately silly stuff. Neither was much of a student at West Point. They both got a lot of demerits. Grant wound up with 290 demerits. He really was not interested in studying at all. There is a story, I do not know if it's true, that one of the charges he was brought up on was kicking a horse, to which he replied in self-defense, "He kicked me first." Considering how much Grant loved horses, I'm a little skeptical on that, but maybe. Grant graduated in a class of 39. He was 21st in a class of 39, almost in the middle. Class of 1843. Ike acquired a lot of demerits, and here are some examples of what earned him demerits. And I remember Ike as this nice grandfatherly old figure. I just can't picture this at all. He was ordered to appear before a cadet corporal in his dress coat. So Ike decided to take this literally. He turned up stark naked except for his dress coat. Ike repeatedly went over the wall at West Point at night to sneak into the nearby towns to buy, are you ready? Ice cream. And sandwiches occasionally. He actually could have been expelled for this. That was a serious offense. In one six-month period, Ike was brought up, disciplined, put it that way, disciplined 15 times. For example, being late for chapel, late for breakfast, failing to make a reasonable effort to have his room ready for inspection, and smoking cigarettes. Yes, gentlemen smoked pipes.
Right.
Right. Ike graduated, his class was 164. He graduated 125th. The year was 1915. Couple of items related to horses in these two men. Grant really was by far the best horseman in his graduating class. On graduation day, he gave a demonstration of jumping. Now, most high jumps, the bar over which the horse was to jump was at most 3 feet high. For this exhibition, Grant said to a couple of very brave young cadets, pick up the bar, place the bar on your shoulders. My horse and I will clear the bar. You won't be scratched. The name of his horse was York. He cleared the bar by 3 or 4 feet, and that record stood at West Point for 25 or 30 years. And there is a story about Ike and horses. In his day, cadets still had to learn how to ride. And Ike was riding, took a really bad fall. This was in his last year as a cadet, and he was injured. And the doctor examining him said, this is a pretty serious injury. And I tell you honestly, if you take another fall like this, you may be crippled for life. I don't think I can authorize you for graduation. So Ike and the doctor got in a debate about this, and finally they compromised. The doctor said, okay, upon graduation, you can request duty either in the infantry or the cavalry. If you will promise me you will not request duty in the cavalry, I'll clear you for graduation. And he did. On the subject of math, I told you Grant was terrific at math, far and away his easiest subject. And there is a story about Ike in a mathematics class, and this is where we begin to get serious. Ike's a cadet. I don't know what year he was, but there was a math problem put up on the blackboard. And Ike solved it in a way that was quicker and, as they say, more elegant than his math professor had mapped out. It was a whole new way to solve the problem. Now, Mr. Korda finds something really revealing in this. He says that over the course of their careers, Grant and Eisenhower both displayed a trait that Napoleon Bonaparte said was the essential ingredient in being a successful general. I can't say the phrase in French, but Napoleon called it the quick glance of genius, which is to say, in a confused situation, you can spot the core problem and its solution almost instantly. You do it almost by instinct. Later, if asked, you can sort out the steps you took to solve the problem, but at that moment, you cut through the murk, you see what the issue is, and you come up with its solution. Grant and Eisenhower both had the quick glance of genius. All right. Now, before I start talking about World War II and some very specific parallels between the two men, I want to go back to their memoirs, because there is something more revealing than what I picked up on the first reading. Korda, Mr. Korda, the author of these 2 books, says, Ike had prepared himself for the task of writing his memoirs by rereading Grant's memoirs, perhaps the greatest work of nonfiction in American literature. I just want you to dwell on that for a second. Grant's memoirs as the greatest work of nonfiction in American literature. And like Grant, Eisenhower aimed for simplicity and simple fact. As a result, Crusade in Europe remains one of the clearest and least opinionated books to come out of World War II, and by far the least exculpatory and the least judgmental. If Ike had an axe to grind, he avoided grinding it in his book. His book is also free of the small-minded bitterness and acid criticism of colleagues, unsweetened by victory time and second thoughts, which marked the books of other leaders. That made me think I better take a closer look at Grant's memoirs and Ike's. What Korda is saying is, although there were plenty of people around them whose reputations they could have smeared with justification, neither man did that. There's something about them that would not let them hurt a man's reputation in that way, even if they deserved it. So here are two concrete examples from both memoirs. First, Grant's memoirs, Civil War. It involves a Union general named William Rosecrans, who by and large was a really, really good officer. However, in 1863, Rosecrans engineers a move that's brilliant. He drives the rebels out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. They retreat south through the mountains, trying to escape into northern Georgia. Rosecrans goes in pursuit. He thinks they are going to keep running, but they don't. They turn and fight at Chickamauga Creek. Rosecrans initially does well, but during the battle, he mistakenly believes that a gap has opened in his lines. So he shifts a large number of his men from one part of the front to this apparent gap in the line. In fact, there is no gap. And in pulling out the men from his left, he creates a gap. And Longstreet's rebels have just come on the scene. They see the opening and they pour through. The Union Army breaks and retreats in chaos back to Chattanooga. 2/3 of the army runs, 1/3 of it holds its ground. General Thomas, the Union general, holds the line, protects the retreat. General Thomas will become known as the Rock of Chickamauga. Where is William Rosecrans at this point? He did not stay at the front. He ran with the 2/3 of his army back to Chattanooga. And you could argue that he understood they would have to set up a defensive perimeter around the city, and he was going to organize that. But that's not what happened. The retreat... Well, no, let me give you the casualties first. The casualties are really staggering. The casualty... Rosecrans lost 1/3 of his army at Chickamauga. He had almost 2,000 killed in action, almost 10,000 wounded, close to 5,000 captured and missing in action. 30% casualties. This was the greatest Union defeat in the Western Theater. It was a big deal. Anyway, they're back in Chattanooga, and it is clear what's happening. The Confederates have come in hot pursuit. They are overlooking the city now. They are on the mountains overlooking Chattanooga. They dominate the supply lines. No food can get into the city. The Union Army, if it doesn't do something, is going to starve to death. Rosecrans sits and sits and sits. And back in Washington, Secretary of War Stanton and Lincoln are getting really alarmed. And Lincoln, who never had a harsh word to say about anybody, says of William Rosecrans, Rosecrans is confused and stunned like a duck hit on the head. They send for Grant. Grant has recently been injured in a riding accident. It is very hard for him to move, let alone cross the mountains, evading the Confederates, but he gets into the city. Rosecrans has become paralyzed. He does nothing to rescue the situation. His subordinate officers love him, but the man is broken psychologically somehow. And Grant will take over. Rosecrans will be sidelined. The counterattack will eventually come and be successful. The rebels will be driven back to Georgia. But here's the deal. A huge defeat, a city almost lost. And what is it that Grant says in his memoirs about Rosecrans? Here's what he says. We held a brief interview in which he described very clearly the situation at Chattanooga and made some excellent suggestions as to what should be done. My only wonder was that he had not carried them out. That is the worst Grant says about this guy. Now, Grant's restraint was even more amazing for this reason. After the war, Rosecrans, he's a congressman from California. He's in Washington, D.C. This is at the time that the bank, Grant and Ward, fails. Grant suddenly, and the country wonders what the heck happened to this. He starts issuing orders in his own personal slang, not in the conventional standard military language. His subordinates, half the time, do not know what the heck the man's talking about. And it takes them hours, if not days, to figure out what he means. Fredendall will not even use the standard map grids. This designates locations. It helps units move in unison. He has his own special language.